Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I am here for another Showdown. I love being able to take these new third-party lenses like the Viltrox Lab series and putting them up against the best. In this case, that is the Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master, which I've now owned for about 4 years. It's a lens I'm very familiar with, and if you have kept up on my reviews, you know that I love this lens. I've done both my initial reviews and then long-term reviews, and I think it's in many ways one of the best 35mm lenses ever made. It's small and compact, it focuses quickly, has great optics, even has great magnification. The Viltrox 35mm f1.2 is the new heavyweight, and I mean that in every way. It comes with even more features, quad focus motors, incredible optics, and the price tag is $400+ less. Now, both of these lenses do have some very unique advantages, and I've been really kind of going hard, shooting a lot of different kind of scenarios, putting them side by side, and just trying to figure out where they excel relative to one another. So which one of these is today's champion? Well, let's jump in, and we're going to find that out today. By the way, if you want a really kind of deep comparison into the optics, the about last third of the video after my conclusion, I'll jump into all of that. And so those of you that want just the facts, you can just stay for the first part of the video. Those of you that want the deep dive, stay until the end and you'll get all of that. I like to start these comparisons by looking at what's similar between the two. In both cases, I would say things that I would say are equal, on par with each other, is that both of them have professional grade build quality. They both have thorough weather sealing, including flooring or similar coatings on the front, seal gaskets all throughout, and then a gasket at the lens mount. They've both got all of that. They have a mostly similar feature set, which includes the ability to manually control aperture, an AF/MF switch, custom function switches, the ability to click, declick the aperture. All of those options are on both lenses. I found, as far as a few optical similarities, that I would say that they both deliver a roughly equal chroma performance. And so if you're shooting the night sky, one advantage, very slight advantage that's going to be there for the Viltrox is that you can obviously open up the aperture a little bit wider to f1.2. But as far as the actual chroma performance and how the images look, they're roughly a wash. And then I also found they had about similar flare resistance. They're both exceptionally good for 35mm lenses, but about equally good. Now, there is a difference that I'll point to that I'll call a neutral difference. And so Sony obviously has Sony's typical approach to aperture. The Lab lens, however, takes something more akin to Nikon and their S-line series of lenses approach to aperture. And I do hope to be able to do a comparison to the f1.2 S-line 35mm lens when I have access to that and when a Z-mount version of the Lab comes out. But if you're coming from the Nikon side of things, then this approach is going to seem more familiar. If you're coming from the Sony side of things, the GM version is going to seem, more familiar to you. I actually am, because I am more familiar with this approach, this is my preference personally, the Sony side of things. However, I do recognize that this is more of a taste thing. I'm going to start by taking a look at reasons to choose the G Master. The biggest reason I think that is going to equal out above all others is the fact that it is much smaller and lighter at 525 grams, which makes it 395 less than the Viltrox's 920 grams. And so if you're wanting to travel light, there is a very obvious difference between these two lenses. I would say that relative to their overall size, they have a similar feeling of heft, of density to them, but there's a lot more lens when it comes to the Lab lens, thus it feels a lot heavier. And so that's a huge difference in weight. It's also, as you can see, it is much smaller. It is 13mm smaller in diameter. It is a whole 25mm shorter in overall length. And so again, if you're wanting to travel compact and light, the GM is an easy winner there. The GM also has a much higher magnification level. It can produce a 0.26 time magnification, while the Viltrox is 0.17 times. And as you can see in this comparison, that is a notable difference. I also noted that a couple of functional improvements with the GM versus the lab lens. With the GM lens, both apertures can be declicked, but with the GM, I can do smoother aperture racks that show no visible steps. And so you can see here, as I rack through the GM, I can make it perform pretty much like a true manual aperture ring, and that I can go smoothly through that, and you can see the specular highlights shrink and then expand, but no visible steps. Whereas if I do the same thing with the lab lens, even if I do my best to be smooth, you can see some visible steps even with the aperture declicked. It's not the worst that I've seen, but it's definitely not as good as the GM. I would say the same is true, in my opinion, when it comes to manual focus. As far as the feel of the ring, both of them have quite similar feel in terms of the overall damping and smoothness, but I did find for doing actual manual focus pulls that the focus throw is a little on the long side, at least at the closer focus distances for the lab lens, and so I could do it with a little less effort and a little bit more precision because I wasn't having to rotate my wrist quite so far as I did with the lab lens. And so I do prefer the manual focus. It's very slight there, but I give a slight win to the GM lens. Sony bakes in a few advantages that you do need to be aware of for their first-party lenses. And so as it plays out here, while both of them can focus extremely fast, as we'll get to in just a second, if you're using a sport-related body, one of the Alpha 1 or the A9 bodies, you're going to be able to achieve whatever the maximum burst rate of the camera is with the GM lens, whereas with the lab, it's going to be a limit of 15 frames per second on the upper end. A secondary issue there, or advantage that Sony bakes in, is that some of their newer cameras have a feature called focus breathing compensation. So if you're shooting in video work, you can eliminate focus breathing, in which both of these lenses have some, and the Sony has even more, but you can eliminate that, though at the cost of a crop factor, as you can see here, by turning on that focus breathing compensation. That's an advantage that the lab doesn't have because Sony only enables that for first-party lenses. Wide open f1.4 versus f1.2, I felt like in a few situations I saw a very slightly less fringing with the GM lens, and that will be broken down in a little bit more detail, a little bit more nuance in the deep dive at the end of the video. If you stop both lenses down to f1.4, I think that advantage probably goes away, but wide open, there's maybe a little bit of an advantage for the GM lens when it comes to fringing. And while the GM has a tiny bit more quantity of distortion, that distortion is more linear and thus easier to correct than what the labs, which is slightly more complex. And also, similarly, the GM lens has very slightly less vignette than what the lab series lens does. And again, with wide open, f1.4 versus f1.2, the GM has very slightly sharper corners relative to the lab series lens. And so there are some of the reasons to consider the GM lens over the lab series lens. So how about reasons to choose the lab series? And there certainly are those as well. So the 35mm f1.2 lab, the first and obvious reason to choose it is going to be price. It currently has an MSRP of $999 US, but if you use the discounted link in the description below, you're going to get that at about $949. And so that is $450 less. That's significant. Another very obvious difference and advantage for the lab lens is that it has a faster maximum aperture, about a half-stop difference between f1.2 and f1.4. And so that means you're going to be able to, it's going to be a little more useful in low light situations. You're going to get more shallow depth of field. And you'll see during our optical breakdown at the end how some of those advantages play out when it comes to that larger maximum aperture. You're also going to find that even when the settings are equalized, that the lab lens has better light transmission. And what I found is that even when shooting my chart, that typically I was seeing at least between a third and a half stop better light transmission with the lab lens than what I did with the GM lens, even when all other settings were equalized. I also found that due to that larger maximum aperture and the effect that it has bigger, softer, specular highlights. And so even with equalized settings, you're going to get bigger, softer specular highlights, bokeh balls, if you want to call them that, with the lab lens and what you are with the GM lens. The lab lens on a feature set side, it is a little bit more customizable. It's got this LCD screen, and that does allow for a few additional features. One of those is that there is an extra function button, and that extra function button is largely designed around, at least natively, around being able to set A/B focus, which is can be a very useful feature to where you can preset 2 focus positions, and at a touch of a button, you can toggle between those 2. And that has definitely some very interesting applications for both stills and video work. You also have the ability, there is an app that Viltrox has that allows you to customize that the function of those function buttons. And so even beyond what you can do within the camera, because there are 2 of them, you have the ability to have both of them achieve different functions. And so that's another area that is useful there. I also found it useful when to consider the fact that the LCD screen shows a distance scale, and that's something that is just missing on mirrorless lenses relative to manual focus lenses or even SLR lenses, to where a lot of times it would show a distance scale. And through this you do. And so if you're trying to do like hyperfocal work, for example, and you can actually see how the depth of field expands as you rotate the aperture ring, and so that you open up the quantity of depth of field that's available to you through that. And so I think that that's interesting. Here's something that was wholly unexpected in going into this review, because I consider the GM lenses to basically be the best focusing lenses of their type across any platform. That may no longer be true because of the Lab Series lens. While they had dual of their new Hyper VCM focus motors on the 135mm Lab, in this 35mm f1.2 Lab, they have gone with quad focus motors. And I suspect that's probably going to be the formula we'll see for the 50 and 85mm f1.2 lenses as well. So having all of that thrust available means that focus is basically instant on the 35mm lens, and while both of them are lightning quick in my test, I found that both in the experience of shooting and then reviewing the footage afterward, that focus is just a hair faster with the Viltrox than what it was with the Sony, and that is a shocker to me. As noted, it's not just the specular highlights, but also when I do a very careful examination of overall rendering and bokeh quality, not just in specular highlights, I find that the backgrounds are just softer and a little bit more pleasing. I would say that I slightly prefer the rendering from the Lab lens in general as compared to the Sony GM lens. The Lab lens is also the sharper lens. It's sharper in the center, it's sharper in the mid frame, and as noted, it's a little behind in the corner, and that kind of depends on which corner you look. But if you stop the Lab down to f1.4, it's now sharper everywhere, everywhere across the frame, and I find that it has a competitive advantage even when stopped down further, with both lenses stopped down further, that it is just the sharper lens, which again is pretty amazing. I also find that the Lab lens has consistently better contrast, and so whether it's fur on an animal or it's skin textures on a human or in a landscape scene, the Lab lens has the ability to resolve fine details just a little bit better than what the GM lens does. So that brings me to my conclusion, and to me this is a pretty remarkable thing. One of the exercises I like to do if I'm doing this kind of comparison is to say, well, if price was no consideration, which one of these lenses would I buy? Because obviously, price is a real consideration for most of us. And in this lens, I'd have to say that even if the prices were equal, I might still choose the Lab lens, which really surprises me. But I'm just thinking objectively, there are some real advantages for me personally, because I can live with the weight. Not everyone can, but because I can live with the weight, I would say that the advantages that the Lab lens offers means that I feel like I might just prefer it. The Sony to me gets really high marks. It always has, it always will, for being such a high-performing lens and such a compact package. This is the premium lens that actually feels more like a mid-size lens. And I really appreciate the fact that Sony is, with their G Master lenses, has so often been able to produce lenses that stay really high performing, but also are smaller than basically all the other what's available on any other platform in terms of this type lens. And so I still give them huge credit for that. But I also have to give Viltrox credit for being able to pull off something that's pretty remarkable, and that is that they have produced an f1.2 lens that is basically better at f1.2 than what the premium lens in the department is at f1.4. a lens that is sharper at f1.2 than another premium lens that is f1.4 has been a very, very rare thing. And what's even more surprising, and I give it even higher marks for, is that it is actually faster focusing at f1.2 than what the GM is at f1.4. And as an f1.2 lens, you just don't see that. I would say that this is probably the fastest focusing 35mm f1.2 lens is that I have ever seen. Now, I haven't yet reviewed the Nikkor S-Line lens, but I wouldn't be surprised because of those quad motors in the lab if it's still a little bit faster in focus speed overall. So that is amazing to me. So I would say go with the GM if you want to keep things light or if you don't really trust third parties. And I get that. And I would say go with the lab if you want to save $400 plus, or if you just want that extra bit of special sauce that an f1.2 lens can give you. Now, again, if you want more information, you can check out the either text or video reviews, full reviews of both of these lenses. I'll have those linked in the description down below. There's buying links there if you want to explore that avenue. Now, if you want to see how I kind of got to these conclusions and look at some of these head-to-head comparisons, then stay tuned with me right now and we'll jump into that deep dive together. So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. The Sony actually has more of the overall distortion. The Viltrox is a milder amount, but what happens here is on Sony, it's quite linear. It's all a consistent pincushion distortion, whereas on the Viltrox, it's mostly pincushion distortion in the corners, but if you start to correct for that, it actually causes a bulge here, as we'll see. So as I start to try to correct for those corners, what happens is the center starts to bulge out, whereas you can see with the Sony, it actually corrects pretty cleanly, even manually. Obviously, correction profile would take care of either one of these, but the nature of the distortion is easier to deal with on the GM lens. Now, as far as the vignette, the quantity is similar. However, there is a bit more on the Viltrox. And so it's basically the difference between less than a third stop of difference or roughly a third stop. And so probably not significant either direction. Now, I don't want to draw too many conclusions from one single shot here when it comes to fringing. What I found is that there was a little bit of give and take as I looked at the two lenses, but what I see at least in this shot is just a little bit more fringing to my eye on the Viltrox. You can see it particularly on this side, whereas the Sony is a little bit more neutral. And so it's, again, neither one of them has any kind of significant amount of fringing, but I think that the Sony takes a mild win there. So next we'll take a look at the overall resolution. So I'm showing this at a 200% magnification, and this is 61 megapixels on an A7R Mark V. So you can see in the center of the frame, the Viltrox, even at f1.2 versus f1.4, is just resolving more fine details. And so you can see it there in the sails. You can see it here in this text that it's just crisper, has better contrast. If we move off towards the mid frame, you can see that while they're close, the black levels are lower in the Viltrox, and so it has just better contrast in general. A bit more detail that's available throughout the face that is there. The only kind of difference is that if you move down into the corners, while there's not a significant difference here in the corner, I do think that it's a little bit muddier here on the Viltrox and a hair better on the G Master. If we move up to this corner, however, I would say that it probably slightly favors the lab instead of the GM lens. Now, if we move to an apples to apples comparison with f1.4 versus f1.4, a couple of things that stand out to me. First of all, the Viltrox looks even better. Second thing I do want to point out is the Viltrox has superior light transmission. You can see that it's metering faster and producing just as bright an image. And so probably at least a third stop better of light transmission, even with equal settings. We can now see that that advantage in the mid frame looks a little bit more significant. Down here in the corner, this corner I don't think looks radically different. Up in this corner, however, the Viltrox definitely is looking better than the G Master by a pretty obvious margin. Likewise here, obviously the Viltrox looks much stronger. If we look up in this corner, I would say it's the opposite. I think the GM looks a little bit better. So it seems like the GM a little bit better on the right side, maybe the Viltrox a little bit better on the left side. However, the Viltrox, it's not consistently true because the Viltrox, I think, looks better here than what the GM does. We move on to f2. Both of them are now just they're ridiculously sharp. However, the Viltrox is obviously sharper and just produces more detail, more contrast. They both look great. I mean, this is totally splitting hairs at this point, but they both have unique strengths. But I would say in general, they both look pretty fantastic at f2. Just great all the way across the frame. We'll go as far as f2.8. At f2.8, the Viltrox kind of takes another leap ahead in the center of the frame, and so it's now kind of next level relative to the GM. But again, I don't know if you would notice that without them 200% side by side. You can see, for example, even here in this text, you can just see it just kind of stands off the page bolder, whereas it looks a little bit flatter on the GM lens. This text looks more three-dimensional, kind of pops off, as you can see, relative to what the GM provides. Up here into this upper corner, you can see it looks amazingly crisp now up here. And the GM also looks very, very good. It's just the Viltrox has just a little bit more pop to it. And you can see here that once again, it's exposing or metering faster, but it's producing at least equal brightness, if not more so. Now, when it comes to the minimum focus distance, this is an easy win for the GM lens. It produces, as you can see, a much higher level of magnification. They both have a usable and useful amount of magnification, but the GM is definitely more so. I can't really draw too many conclusions about up-close performance from this for the simple reason that there's going to be more depth of field on the Viltrox just because it's further away, and the depth of field is going to be more shallow because it's up close here on the GM. I would say what we can tell is that both of them look good, very good detail and contrast, and we can also tell that there's not issues with fringing in these bright areas. They're both holding up nicely in that regard. So how about some portrait comparisons? Again, as in all this series, Viltrox is going to be on the left and the GM on the right. Now, I'm going to move the faces around a little bit, and so they match as much as possible. We can see that there is a little bit different rendering in terms of the color science, and I would say that the Viltrox is rendering just a little bit warmer when it comes to skin tones. Also, even at f1.2 versus f1.4, the Viltrox has the superior contrast. If you look around the eyelashes and even into the beard there, and skin textures in general, the Viltrox is showing more. In this case, I don't know that there's really much of a difference that I can see as far as the defocus area, and we'll look more at that a little bit later. This home sign back here is obviously going to be a little bit more blurred because, again, it's f1.2 versus f1.4. So this shot is f1.4 versus f1.4, and I'll let you kind of absorb it in general. I've turned corrections off on either one of them, so this is completely uncorrected. This is a raw image right out of camera with no corrections at all. So as far as the detail, I mean, again, we've already kind of had this dance, and we know that the Viltrox is the sharper, higher contrast lens of the two. And if you put them both at f1.4, there's just more pop for the Viltrox, and so that's a win there. As far as the overall color rendering, you can see, again, the difference is subtle. Again, it's I would say very slightly more neutral or even a hair cooler on the GM, a little bit warmer on the lab lens. Frankly, in this particular setting, I probably would say I favor the warmer look, but that's entirely a taste thing, and you could very easily process these two to match. Here now at f2, and so you can see again the backgrounds. They just look really similar. I can't draw too many conclusions from the background. Again, colors are close, very slightly different, and now of course we know that they're both really sharp, but the Viltrox still looks a little bit sharper as far as the overall skin textures and contrast. Both of them, I think, produce nice skin tones. Skin tones don't look waxy or anything to me, and so overall I think they look pretty great. This shot here allows you to take another look at overall kind of just the scene in general. In terms of the defocus, both of them at f1.4 for this shot, and amazingly, I managed to get Nala in pretty much the same position, which was somewhat of a miracle. I would say that, again, I think that the contrast levels are superior on the Viltrox. And here there's window light, so it's fairly aggressive light, and so it's going to produce some kind of hot spots there. What I'm finding is that if you look around the eyes, the contrast levels, they're deeper on the Viltrox, and so it just makes the eyes pop a little bit more detail in the fur there that you can see looking at that. looking at the scene at large, the bokeh quality really, I can't draw any conclusions from this. I don't think that it looks any different to me. We see here there is a contrast point where there could be some fringing, and in this particular shot, fringing looks equal on the two. Of course, this is both at f1.4, whereas before the Viltrox is at f1.2. And so I think all things being equal, it looks like if you're at f1.4, in this shot at least, the Viltrox probably is showing a little bit less fringing than what the GM is. Now, this is going to be an interesting series because it allows us to look a little bit more at the bokeh, which is my priority here. It's less about the focus. I've tried to get focus in the same zone here, and so that's important. But just look at first of all, at specular highlights. We can see here that they are softer. With the Viltrox is at f1.2, it obviously has an advantage, and you can see that. It looks just softer in that zone. Also in this zone here, those specular highlights look softer. But somewhere in like this zone where there's a little bit extra maybe busyness, more going on here, the Viltrox definitely looks softer in this area here. And so if I back out for a moment and we just kind of look at this area, it's going to look a little softer and creamier on the Viltrox. So how about if I make the Viltrox f1.4? Well, taking a look at those specular highlights again, one of the things that some people don't know about larger aperture lenses is that even when you equalize the aperture settings, they, for whatever reason, tend to have softer, larger specular highlights anyway. And so that's certainly the case here. We can see it in this zone as well, that everything's just a little bit bigger and thus a little bit softer, a little bit less outlining. And into this zone here, even though it's same aperture now, it's still a little bit busier and a little bit less soft on the GM versus the Viltrox, which does kind of a superior job in this area of just keeping everything soft and creamy looking. Here, if we look at them both at f2, we can see looking up here, once again, rounder, softer specular highlights in these zones. And so the Viltrox is basically always going to win that particular comparison. And I think that it continues to win the comparison through here as well, where everything just stays a little bit softer and a little creamier on the Viltrox lens. Likewise here, and I think with these greens, I think you can see that definitely the greens look a little bit warmer on the Viltrox than what they do on the GM. Just, again, it's a taste thing. You're going to like one or the other probably instinctively, and whichever one you like better, there's your answer. As far as this defocused area, again, at f1.2, the Viltrox is going to win. And that's the advantage of an f1.2 lens. The depth of field is shallower, and thus everything that is out of focus is just softer looking, creamier looking, and I think that holds up here. And again, that continues to be true even if I stop the Viltrox down to f1.4. And so still, this area looks softer. It's just more defocused. The background it's just creamier looking. And so I think in terms of general rendering, I'm going to favor the Viltrox just because of its ability to make everything softer. And here in this zone, which is kind of a transition zone, again, I think that while it's not a huge margin, if we look at it globally, it's just a little bit more eye-catching with the GM and a little bit softer on the Viltrox. So finally, looking a little bit more carefully at those specular highlights. So our point of focus in this shot is here, and you can see, they're both brilliantly sharp lenses. Depth of field's a little more shallow on the Viltrox, obviously at f1.2, but it is every bit as sharp and as good a contrast. So here you can see that there's a bit more fringing on the Viltrox, and we'll revisit that when they're both at f1.4. If we look at the specular highlights, you can see that they are very noticeably bigger and softer for the Viltrox than they are for the GM lens. Both of them start to exhibit some cat eye near the corner, but you can see that it's a little bit less so on the Viltrox than what it is on the GM lens. So now with both of them at f1.4, we can see that the advantage that was there as far as fringing has gone away. They basically look equal here. Both of them have just a tiny bit of green fringing, but I wouldn't say that one has more than the other. Again, we see that same truth here in that while both of them are f1.4, specular highlights are still bigger and thus more out of focus than what we see with the f1.4 lens. And so it's just an advantage that carries on there, even if you have all other settings being equal. So as we get to the conclusion of that section, you can see that both of these lenses are impressive. But I would say that, at least as far as the optics go, the Viltrox is a little bit more impressive. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.